Public Service Media Symposium hosted by the SOS Coalition. My name is Simon Makwela. I will be your program director today. Just a couple of house rules. The first one being that the restrooms are just down the hall to your right on the way to the lift on the far end by the bar. And please put your cell phones on mute and your microphones on mute if you're online.
Recording in progress.
Thank you. There's coffee in the lobby. And then also please feel free as an audience to engage in the discussions as well. Your collective voices are very important. Right. So today we're gathering at a critical juncture for public service media in South Africa. The SABC, despite its challenges, remains a primary source of news and information for millions of South Africans who would otherwise be excluded from democratic participation. This is not an abstract theory. This is a material reality for the poor and marginalized. The 2024 Symposium established this annual gathering to ensure public service media does not become a footnote in the digital age. We return because the work is unfinished. The threats are escalating. The digital transformation and reshaping all media brings both opportunity and danger. Misinformation spreads faster than truth. Funding models collapse under the pressure from platforms and existing value without contributing to public service. Today, we examine these challenges without sentimentality. 4 sessions will test our assumptions to push us towards solutions that work in the real world and not just policy documents. We begin with the SABC funding model. This is existential. Without substantial funding, sustainable funding, there's no public service media. The conversation must move beyond complaints to workable solutions. Session 2 marks 75 years of SABC News. This is not nostalgia. It is an opportunity to measure how far we have come and how far we have to go. After lunch, we'll confront the Canal Plus acquisition of MultiChoice. This challenges the broadcasting landscape fundamentally. We need to understand the implications for local content, for jobs, and for the survival of independent local content production. Our final session examines information integrity through the lens of African Commission Resolutions 630 and 631. These frameworks offer a concrete tool for addressing misinformation and protecting media freedom across the continent. This program brings together policymakers, practitioners, academics, and advocates. The diversity of perspective matters. We need friction between these ideas to generate heat and light, and not just comfortable consensus. The SOS Coalition commits to hosting this symposium annually because public service media must remain in the public agenda. Democratic participation depends on information. Informed citizens depend on accessible, reliable news and information. This dependency chain breaks without strong public service media and the will to maintain its integrity. The quality of our discussions today will shape the policy and legislation that determines whether public service media survives the next decade, and your collective voices are important. Let's begin. So the objectives of this symposium are, I'm going to read these straight from the program itself, to deepen understanding of the current state of public service media in South Africa, along with key defining internal and environmental changes in the bid to strengthen its role amid the evolving digital media environment. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker today for our welcome address, Ms. Uyanda Siatola, which is the National Coordinator of the SOS Coalition. Uyanda?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. So I am going to try and be formal. Distinguished guests, highly esteemed colleagues. It's not working, right? So yeah, I hate being formal, but good morning on a very lighter note and a more realistic approach. Good morning to all of you, and thank you very much for being here today. So as already introduced, my name is Uyanda Siotula. I am the National Coordinator of the SOS Support Public Broadcasting Coalition. It is truly a pleasure to welcome you all, to have you here today. This is our second annual Public Service Media Symposium, and we are looking forward to the engagements, to getting your views, here today. So before I go any further, I would like to take a moment to thank our partner and sponsor, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. I hope I pronounced it correctly. So we deeply, deeply appreciate the support from CAS and their commitment to ensuring that public service media remains in the public domain. So I have attended a few of CAS's engagements on public service media, and I can truly say that they are committed to ensuring that, public service media is highlighted, and they do value, its importance. And they're very good at creating platforms for discussions around public service media. So thank you once again. So to those who are really not familiar with SOS Coalition, we are a coalition of different organizations and individuals that came together in 2008 because of the need to support the SABC. So in fact, when we started off as Save Our SABC, but over the years, we realized that no, the SABC doesn't need saving, it needs to be supported. And then our name also evolved to supporting public broadcasting. So over the years, our work has ranged from lobbying, advocacy, legal interventions, campaigning, and research. And I would like you for a moment to pretend it's someone else that's standing here so that I can, freely say that over the years, SOS has done a stellar job. But I also don't want to, blow our own horn. So yeah. So we were founded on the principle that the SABC is a cornerstone of our democracy. It is through the SABC that millions of South Africans are able to realize their right to access information, free universal access to quality local public interest content that informs, educates, people, especially the poor and the marginalized, ensuring that they are not excluded from democratic participation. So we all know the issues at the SABC, so we're very familiar, with the financial challenges that plague the SABC, the difficulty to adapt to, the digital environment, and especially, the political, pressure as well that the SABC faces. So we know about the unfunded public mandates. We also know that, the consequences of that lack of funding from government has been that the SABC over the years has, cut back on commissioning local content. We've lost very important shows such as Sieven Dilan, Mubango, and these are the shows that really reflect our diversity as a country. So environmentally, there's also been some challenges. We know the dragging draft white paper. the controversy that surrounds the SABC bill. And we know that there's now a new funding model that is being developed, and the department has recently appointed a service provider. So these are just some of the challenges that the SABC has been that SABC has been facing recently. And I think in various forums we have established that there is consensus, that the current funding model is not viable for the SABC, and that the financial crisis is deepening, as well as the fact that the legislative environment is not fit for purpose in the digital age. However, what we often don't talk about are the solutions, and I think this gathering today will really, be a platform to share some of those solutions. And so we have got really amazing panelists, people who are experts in the sector as our speakers, so we look forward to, their insights. Because those insights are very useful, not only to diagnose what the SABC is going through, or whatever disease is plaguing the SABC, but to also, develop some sort of a cure. If a cure is too ambitious, maybe a treatment plan, even a doctor's note, prescription, something, right? But I think, a time has come for us to have these conversations and look at, the healing and the restoration of our public broadcaster. So this is longer than I thought it would be. But as I move to close, so this symposium is strategically placed. It draws from, it draws inspiration from local and global commemorations. So the global ones being the International Day of Universal Access to Information, as well as the News Day, the World News Day, my apologies. It is also positioned at the beginning of October, where, South Africa celebrates media freedom. So these global events that I just mentioned really should remind us to observe global best practice as we engage here today. So, thank you. So on behalf of the SOS Support Public Broadcasting Coalition, with the powers vested in me, and I'm also hotspotting from the powers of our chairperson there at the back, I declare this gathering open, and thank you very much. I wish you fruitful discussions.
Thanks, Yanda. I'm going to remain a little bit formal because I've got a mandate from you, actually, to remain formal. And thank you for outlining the beautiful work that SOS Coalition does do. I think it's very, very important work, and thank you for putting together this gathering. I would like to take this moment to move on to our next speaker, who's Mr. Henrik Sitting, who's the Director of Media Programs in Sub-Saharan Africa for Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Excuse me for mispronouncing it, CAS. It's online.
Guten Morgen und herzlich willkommen. That's what we say in Germany. Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Henrik Sitting. I'm the director of the Regional Media Program for Sub-Saharan Africa at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, based here in lovely Johannesburg. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you in person today, but I send you my warmest regards and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this important event. First, I would like to thank the SOS Coalition and especially Uyanda for the excellent cooperation and partnership. It's always a pleasure to work with you. As you may know, the work of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is broad, especially at the international level. Through our more than 100 offices worldwide, we promote democracy, the rule of law, political dialogue, and international cooperation. A key part of our mission is to support media freedom and journalists who understand and embrace their vital independent role in a democracy. This is a core task of our regional media program for Sub-Saharan Africa. Through conferences, workshops, roundtables, and studies, we aim to strengthen press freedom, improve working conditions for for media professionals and foster greater self-confidence and solidarity among journalists across the continent. If you have any questions about our work, our projects, or how to get involved, please don't hesitate to speak to my colleague Kaylin, who is with you today. One of our main focus areas is the future of public service media. We are convinced that it is an essential pillar of democratic societies, as long as it can operate independently and is well funded to fulfill its mandate. In our view, public broadcasters must serve as advocates for the public, their viewers, listeners, and online users. Public media should never become a tool in the hand of politics. Public broadcasting is constantly facing major challenges. Today, for example, the convergence of media, meaning the merging of television, radio, and online platforms, the rise of disinformation and fake news, which undermine the credibility of traditional media, the constant search for adequate funding and the right independent financing model, the challenge of attracting younger audiences, the ongoing balancing act between editorial independence and political pressure, and last but not least, the constant struggle for legitimacy and relevance in society. Why does public broadcasting matter? What values must it represent? And to which values is it committed? These are the kinds of questions I'm sure you will discuss in debate today, and rightly so. We need answers for the future. Public service broadcasting matters in South Africa, in Germany, and around the world. I wish you an inspiring and productive conference day, and Uyanda, you know where to find us if you need support. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay, moving right along to the chairperson of the SOS board and the executive director of the Freedom of Expression Institute, Mr. Samkelo Mokine.
Morning, everyone. Morning once again. Mine is just to say welcome from the board, but in particular, just to outline the seriousness of the task that's facing us, in as much as we are here to talk about the solutions to public service, to the public service, we are faced with a problem that has endured for the past 30 odd years under democracy, and that this problem that we face is not going to get any easier. I think we've all been exposed to the way that the government has systematically not wanted to fund the SAPC. I think it's quite clear that there's a lot of funds that have gone through to ESCOM, there's a lot of funds that have gone through to the post office, but for some reason there is a problem with the SAPC. There's a problem with funding the SAPC. And this problem is bound to endure. And so with some of the speakers that are going to be here today, I hope they'll try and give us a clear path about how best to take our fight around funding for the SAPC to the next level. With those few words, I'd like to say thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Now for our keynote address, which will be online from Ms. Deslyn Daniels, who's the Advocacy and Projects Coordinator for Public Media Alliance.
Great. Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So it's an honor to be with you all today, and my sincere thanks to our friends at SOS Coalition for the invitation. At the Public Media Alliance, our mission is to connect, support, and advocate for public service media around the world. Now, that term, public service media, is a loaded one, but at its core, its values are anchored in editorial and organizational independence, universality, transparency, impartiality, genuine service to diverse audiences, and of course, a public source of funding. These values are very much alive in South Africa's debates, especially funding. But my goal for today is to set a global frame so we can place South Africa's conversations in context. So, central to this conversation around public media is viability. Around the world, public media, whether they are big or small, are dealing with a stacked deck. There are deep revenue gaps, audiences are fragmented, and big tech companies are increasingly standing between public media outlets and audiences. What was once a hard fight for viability is now an existential one. In practice, the fight shows up as job cuts and pared back programming schedules, as we've seen in Australia, the UK, the US, and elsewhere, like in South Africa, as Uyanda mentioned. Now, you're probably listening and thinking these challenges and many others have been around for a long time. And in that case, you would be correct. It's why the Public Media Alliance has been around since 1945. But it's not just the accelerating pace of change, but wider economic fragility. In the 2025 World Press Freedom Index, economic fragility is flagged as a leading threat to press freedom. And it cannot be denied that this economic fragility is intrinsically linked to harsher political climates globally, which are eroding the conditions the media and press freedom need to thrive. And yes, this fragility impacts both public and private media, but as you can imagine, public media sit closest to the blast radius. Their funding is their lifeline. And whether it's license fees, parliamentary appropriations, or levies, these are often at the whims of politicians and reframed by populists as your public money is funding their bias. And as public media are funded in public view, they're also the first to feel political headwinds. And that's a backdrop against which two macro pressures are now biting. On one side, we're facing the long, steady squeeze from authoritarian governments spending big to shape global narratives. UK parliamentary evidence and BBC leaders warn that Russia and China's state media now outspend the BBC World Service. I want to pause here for a second to quiz the attendees. Unfortunately, I can't see you, so I'll ask you instead to keep a figure in mind. Can anyone guess how much Russia and China together spend each year on their state-backed international media? For context, the BBC World Service spends about 400 million pounds a year. So keep a figure in mind, and then I'll circle back in a moment. So Russia and China are spending big while the World Service is fighting for stable funding. And that imbalance isn't abstract. It's turning up in Africa, the Middle East, and in Latin America, where state-backed outlets are filling vacuums and gaining audience share. At the same time, there is a new precedent emerging from the United States. We've seen high-profile tech courtship followed by a harder line on independent media. We've seen the federal funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting being rescinded and CPB's wind down now on the way. And for those who don't know about the CPB is a non-governmental organization that's been around for 58 years, and it distributed the federal funding within the US public media system. And now we're seeing that there are proposed visa limits that would sharply shorten I-visas for foreign journalists. All of this has happened in a span of about 10 months. Like it or not, what happens in the US is agenda setting, and it risks giving cover to politicians elsewhere to take a tougher stance against independent, critical public media. We've already seen versions of that, from the shuttering of Argentina's public media news agency Telam to continued public media capture in Hungary, and also contested media environments in the Czech Republic, a country that's currently in the top 10 for press freedom worldwide. And going back to the quiz, where I actually keep a figure in mind, like I said, I can't see you, so I'm going to be holding you to account. Some of you might have guessed around maybe £1 billion, maybe between 2 to 5 billion pounds, maybe it's more than 10. But the actual figure indicates that Russia and China together spend as much as £6 to 8 billion. So that's 140 to 186 billion South Africa Rand on their efforts. And that's just in a year. So now that we've mapped the headwinds, let me offer a few anchors so you can carry into today's sessions. Promise to move us from problems to practical solutions. Some things to keep in mind today. Firstly, we need to have conversations around funding realism without fatalism. For instance, how can we increase stability and lower volatility? If license compliance is structurally low, is a modernized mixed model, such as public appropriation plus targeted levies plus commercial revenue with safeguards, maybe even with philanthropy, is that more honest than hoping for a compliance miracle? Around the conversation on funding, public media must also be explicit about the public bargain. In the US, the CPB vacuum has forced stations to spell out what disappears when the lifeline is cut. Children's content, emergency broadcasting, local newsrooms, cultural programming. How can that be done before the crisis and not after? It's both a marketing and advocacy and a media literacy issue. Independence is the other big thing. How do we make independence as design and not aspiration? Insulating governance is key. Lock in board appointment rules, conflict of interest checks, and sunset-proof charters. The moment of reform is the moment to hardwire independence so that it survives hostile cycles. If we just look at Central Europe, like with the Czech Republic, we can find examples of what happens when reforms stall. In Sweden, they are making the case that it is the independence of public service media that makes it a crucial asset at times of crisis or even invasion, making a more compelling case for more conservative governments. Next, audience first and audience building first is one area I hope is thought about today. Trust is earned in service. If citizens don't feel served, they won't feel obliged to pay, whatever the instrument. How can funding reform be paired with visible service improvements, such as local accountability journalism, verifiably impartial election coverage, and civic information that solves daily problems? I also hope that you keep media literacy in mind. Media literacy isn't a side project. Invest in audience capability and not just content. Where public media have media literacy programs, we've seen communities actually able to articulate the value of public media more clearly. That's a social foundation for sustainable founding. And in the same vein of speaking about audiences, we must keep in mind that distribution belongs to the public and not the platform. In your discussions today, question how we can reduce single platform dependency and diversify routes to audiences. AI will naturally be part of your conversations, but remember that AI must serve public media charters, not the other way around. PMA recently released a research report on how public media organizations use AI, and the key takeaway is that public media get the biggest gains from accessibility, repurposing, and human-checked translations, providing they keep control of their data, their archives, and their exits from any single vendor. We will soon release our second report on the procurement of these AI tools. Finally, it's important that we act together, buy together, and learn together. What role can national, regional, and global alliances play in multiplying leverage? How can small and mid-sized public media share technology, rights frameworks, training, and even co-productions? When funding shocks hit, or when governments test the line, alliances and value-driven collaborations can respond faster and with greater legitimacy. Now, for my final point, what I want you to take away from me today is that yes, while the picture may look bleak, there are glimmers of hope. Trust indicators still put public broadcasters among the most trusted news sources in many countries. Cross-border collaboration is deepening, from news exchange and public media co-productions to joint investigative and fact-checking programs. And we're proving that we can do more together than alone. Public media are adapting to reach people where they are with youth first programs, such as explainers on WhatsApp, on TikTok, podcasts that travel, smart TV prominence deals, all while keeping broadcast as a reliability backbone. And crucially, when citizens are asked directly, they often back the principle, as seen in Switzerland's vote to keep funding its public broadcaster. A reminder that public media can still win when we show our value plainly. Values unite public service media, and so do the shared challenges, but that also creates a case for shared solutions and collaboration. Some more good news, there's a role for everyone here today. I've seen today's agenda, and there are plenty of opportunities for discussion. These conversations are what drive change. Just earlier this week on social media, I saw someone say, between now and meaningful change in your community are 1,000 boring meetings that need good people to attend. Now, I don't expect that today's sessions will be boring, but the point stands. We need good people to put in the effort to turn up to the meetings, to ask the questions that need asking, and to come up with solutions that matter. I hope that today is the beginning of that, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Deslan. All right, so moving on to our first session, as I welcome our panelists, Dimitri Martinez and Ms. Thandeka Gqubela Mbeki, to the panel stage, please. And the moderator is Kate Skinner, who's Executive Director of the Association of Independent Publishers. The topic is the funding model for the SABC. As we are aware that the SABC has been quite financially strained in the last decade or so, and they've recently put out a tender to develop a new funding model, which will hopefully turn things around there. So we'll be discussing that. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Kate. And
thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is such a wonderful opportunity to be here, and I'm really honored, and thank you very much to Oyanda for inviting me. This is basically a trip down memory lane. I have been working on public broadcasting issues for a very long time. I can't even tell you how long. And what is interesting for me is that we have been talking about the funding model of the SABC since those days, the days that the SOS coalition was literally formed, which was 2008. So, and I'm also really honored to have these two amazing guests with me, because again, these two people have actually been part of that very long journey with me. And so again, it's an absolute honor to be able to introduce you, and then to get your presentations and for us to have a conversation. So first is Thandeka Gqubela Mbeki. So I'm going to summarize your bio because it's a very long one. But in summary, you are an award-winning journalist, a writer, an activist, a PhD candidate and lecturer at Rhodes University. And I just want to pinpoint one really important thing, particularly for me in terms of your background, was the courage that you had when you stood up against Claudio Motsoeneng and you were part of the SABC 8. And in fact, when I wrote my PhD, one of the things that I did is I dedicated that work to the kind of activists within the SABC itself. So welcome, Thandeka. Lovely to have you here. And then Dimitri Martinez, equally an amazing activist over many years. At the moment, principal consultant at MCM Digital Media, which is an organization that focuses on advancing media strategies and regulatory practices across the whole African continent. You have been a constant friend of SOS, and through the years, you have put together incredible, thoughtful, detailed, in-depth research, which has been, incredibly helpful to the cause. So what we're going to do with this session is we are going to have two presentations, in-depth presentations from our speakers, and then we're going to have a conversation amongst ourselves, and then we're going to open it up to everyone else. So what I would like is for you, Dimitri, if that's possible, to start, and then to talk to the details of the crisis that we find ourselves in, and some of the issues, and then pointing to the solutions. So yeah, over to you, Dimitri.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon. Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Kate, Tandeka, lovely to see you again as well. Biyanda and colleagues from SOS and colleagues in the room. It really is an absolute honor to be here again. And we say again because indeed I had hair when we started the discussion about public service and particularly the funding model. So it has been a while, but there have been some many advances, there have been some many gains. And Kate, thanks for mentioning the SABC aid, because my intention, in fact, was to say that one of the things we need to remember as the dates that Uyanda spoke about is the fact that there were 8 brave people who put their bodies on the line, literally. And just as people are celebrating the memory of Ms. Deokaran in the Tembisa scandal, etc., you know, we're looking at very much some systemic issues, and so thank you for that reminder. So looking at the theme of advancing public service media, and particularly the very core issue of funding, these are the areas that I'm going to be focusing on, looking at this policy vacuum that we've been in for a very long time, and that has also caused the legislative environment to literally come to a halt, and likewise the regulatory environment. Looking at some of the current challenges and structural problems with the current workable model, I was asked specifically to look at the tender that the department has put out for the development of a funding model. Then looking at specifically the current government funding and possible revenue streams, some global trends and lessons that we're seeing, as was mentioned earlier, that, you know, it's public service media globally are under threat. It's not anything unique to South Africa. And then some key considerations for implementing a new model. So, as most of you will know, we have a draft white paper. The submissions on the draft white paper closed on Friday last week. And I just wanted to focus on some of the positive, and I could only find 2 things, and lots and lots on the red side. But quite frankly, what I'm going to conclude is that I think we have our priorities wrong in that particular paper. On the positive side, a final version appears to be close. We started this process in 2016, and you know, people were waiting for a final white paper, and we got a request for another 2 years. And then the other positive thing, the idea of a regulatory sandbox, the idea that sorry, I didn't switch this off, that we should be looking at very agile regulatory approaches, and that I think is a very positive forward-looking thing. On the debit side, 10 years in the making, which means there's been a policy lag. Things have been, the market has developed, organizations have moved on, etc., and likewise a regulatory lag. We have over-the-top systems coming into the country, over-the-top operators that have sucked out not only the oxygen from the market, but 50% of all advertising revenue. They are not in a regulated space. I believe that the policy paper is overloaded because of this time lag, the department has just added more and more things into there. For example, online safety, I believe, should be sitting. And most terrifying of all, there was nothing on public broadcasting in a policy paper where we were expecting proposals about the mandate and funding of the public broadcaster. So if we look at the fact that there is still so much trust in the public service media, and specifically the SABC, this study, if you just look at the column under South Africa, the most trusted brands, where do people go? If they receive a WhatsApp to say, you know, the sky is green, where do they go and check to see? And SABC is up there as one of the trusted sources. So SABC has always had a mixed funding model, nothing unique. Many public broadcasters around the world. The difference, which is made up of those different advertising, TV license, etc. The difference is that in South Africa, it's been a very heavy reliance on commercial funding. In the past financial year, 71% of the SABC's funding came from advertising and sponsorship, only 14% from license fees, essentially an 84% evasion rate. In other words, when we talk about evasion rate, these are people who can afford but don't pay. And a very high collection fee, 30%. So 30% in every, 30 cents in every rand goes to collecting the license fee. I'm not going to go through the details, but you can see the SABC has an extensive mandate from universal access, language, sport, etc., etc., etc. I'm assuming people will have access to this presentation, so I'm not going to take too much time, but just to remind ourselves that we have a mandate that is largely unfunded. So all of those things, we hadn't even mentioned elections. We haven't mentioned what we can call state events, opening of parliament, presidential inauguration, state funerals, coverage of political party congresses, conferences, etc. Children's programming, vital to have original, fresh original content for our young people, made in South Africa, in our local languages, educational programming, etc. The thing is that these types of events cause havoc with the programming schedule. We've got an SABC board member with us, and perhaps she'll share some of her thoughts later. But, you know, when you're talking about advertising being such an important source of revenue, and suddenly you tell your advertiser, listen, sorry, we've got to actually pull that programming because we've got a state funeral, and you know, they literally refund that money, or they have to provide value in another way. So the impact on viewership, we might have many people watching these events, but these are not events that bring in money. There's been no increase in the TV license fee since 2013, and in 2013 there was a slight bump up from 250 to 265. That's 72 cents a day, guys. How many people have got a TV license? Be honest. I'm so impressed. It's almost half of the room. There's been no capital investment in the organization. There was a bailout, so-called. I wouldn't call it a bailout. But, you know, when you talk about government as a shareholder, what do shareholders do? They put money into the organization. They invest capital. And there's no ability of the organization to raise capital from the markets because you require a guarantee from government. So we have what's called an unfunded mandate. Now, one of the biggest problems of the white paper I mentioned was there was nothing about public broadcasting. And why is that important? People were waiting for an idea for government to sketch out its new thinking about what mandate do we want. Is the one that's currently in the Broadcasting Act sufficient? And once we know what the mandate is, then we can talk about a funding model. To be developing a funding model in a vacuum, there's a risk that this is going to be done in an ad hoc, piecemeal manner. And we don't live in an ideal world, I accept that. But to simply have this happening now without a proper policy in place, it's as risky as proceeding with the SABC bill in Parliament. And Parliament are saying, well, you know what, guys, we're not seeing any movement in Pretoria, so we're going to proceed with the bill. But that's also in the same policy vacuum. So when we talk about it, we say, what is the SABC's mandate? In other words, where does it derive its authority to do what it does? And then what is the SABC's remit? In other words, what are the tangible things? What is the public value that we're talking about? And most important, who decides? We've spoken about the government funding. The direct grants, they're currently at 4%, but those go to very specific projects. For example, Channel Africa. The colleague earlier from Public Media Alliance spoke about how much money the Chinese and the Russians and others put into. So this is about promoting South Africa to the rest of the world. It's a very specific. So what other revenue streams could there possibly be? Perhaps government departments like education could have a line item in their budget for educational programming. Health, and that money is made available to the SABC to develop content that goes out on the airwaves. And so with many others, I've just listed education and health there. Digital revenues. If the digital players are pulling so much advertising, why can't we play in that market? And we've seen how successful SABC Plus has been now, with limited content and vast archives, music, content, etc. Content licensing and sales. Kate's looking at me. I don't know how much time I've got, but we're almost done. Okay.
No, that's fine, because I think these are very important.
All right.
And we need them. Yeah.
Thank you. So, you know, just looking at some of the global trends that where we say we're not that different, yet we do have very unique challenges. So globally, public service under siege, both from a political and a financial perspective. Crisis of legitimacy, crisis of funding, PBS being unfunded. I mean, in the US, apart from the other lunacies there. But there's some pushback. It's not just happening in a sense that, you know, we're just taking this lying down. People are fighting back right across the board. Different broadcasters in Europe, in Latin America, in the East, these sorts of things. A much heavier reliance on commercial revenue with very few exceptions. Political interference with board appointments or attempts to influence the mandate and the content of public media. So the lessons, basically we need to have the right kind of funding that protects the independence and autonomy of the institutions. And we no longer speak about public service broadcasters, but public service media, to understand the new ecosystem that we operate in. Recognizing public interest media as a public good, and looking at the public value that these organizations actually deliver. And then multi-year funding, which is not reliant on political patronage. And this multi-year funding is so, so important, because then the organizations can plan. It's not every year reliant on, are we going to get the money, aren't we going to get the money? She mentioned AI, so I thought I'll just say two things about it. The jobs at risk, relevant to us, writers and authors, halfway down, and broadcast announcers and radio DJs. Oh dear. So these disruptive technologies, just to give you a sense of how fast these things are moving. How long do you think it took Netflix to achieve 1 million users? Just throw out a number. How long did it take Netflix to get to 1 million users? Anything? 11 years? Month? Okay, let's see. 3.5 years. Airbnb, 2.5 years. 10 months. 5 months Spotify to reach 1 million users. iPhone, 74 days. Instagram, 45 days. 5 days. And we now have 123 million visits per day on GPT. That's right. So the market, this digital market, you can see the exponential growth, both revenues and number of users. Where's the advertising going? To digital. Look at TV tanking. Look at all the other media tanking. So talking about, and this is where I'll come to an end, we've got to get the remit right. So mandate is, where do we derive our authority? Remit is, what are we delivering, right? We need to clearly define what we want the SABC to deliver and to secure multi-year funding, not finding, to protect its independence. We need, and independence doesn't just, it's the organization, independent board, people with that critically think and challenge and look at protecting the organization and protecting the asset, the cultural value, replacing this TV license fee that has been killing everybody, and direct funding of the remit via a parliamentary appropriation, not through a department, but directly through Parliament. Growing the digital platforms, so both the ad revenue and the content, and regulate OTT. None of this is possible without some kind of bringing in the OTT under the net. So I see the public service broadcaster as that member of our family that remembers the stories, remembers our history. She shares with us that history, that the stories, the myths, the family history, that who I see the SABC as. So thanks very much for listening, and thanks for letting me join
Thanks,
this
Dimitri.
discussion.
So thanks so much, Dimitri. So we're now going to move to Thandeka, but just to say that we are going to unpack in detail your proposals, because I think that's where we want to take things. So Thandeka, over to you. We're going to look at the neoliberal strangulation of the SABC, so real deep dive into the funding model. So thank you. We're looking forward to it, Thandeka. Have you? Of course. No problem.
I'd like to explain the background story to the title. It's not the title of my research, but it's an extraction from my PhD findings and discussion and conclusions. After being at the SABC and having these many discussions over many years, and being part of the SABC 8, I had a gnawing feeling that something else plagues us. Beyond the figures, beyond the organogram, and beyond the vague independence of the SABC, or the problematic independence, I witnessed the chaos on the balance sheet and looked at the withering fortunes year on year, and the declining contribution of the state to the revenues of the SABC, and declining vis-a-vis the apartheid states' contributions to the SABC. Those are the direct contributions from the fiscus. Then it occurred to me that something else was going on at a civilizational level. The SABC is not just the cousin who reminds us of our histories. It is one of those institutions that are designed in our constitution to defend and propel democracy and democratic values. So it's central to the nature of the citizens' experience of our hard-won democracy. So when I read the minister's utterances that he would flog the need to have the asset to the public in a sort of survey or plebiscite, and sell off components of it to the highest bidder, and after a survey as to whether we need the SABC as a nation or not, I started to double down on this research. Here's the thing. Something went wrong at the civilizational level, not just in South Africa, but universally. And that thing that happened began to erode public broadcasting and turn it into a mere corpse of what it was supposed to be. I recommend to you the book of Michael Tracy, which you would have read, on the decline, the global decline of public broadcasting. And he says that its decline is occasioned by the kind of societies that we create and the kind of economic thinking that we have absorbed as normal. He also, like David Harvey, who is a critic, one of the leading critics on neoliberalism, argues that after the Second World War, where governments around the world, including in Germany, began to take public broadcasting very seriously because it was involved in nation building, the reconstruction after two battles, two big world wars. So the infrastructure for television was developed when the BBC was born in 1922, but in the period between the two world wars, the interbellum, the growing technologies and the idea of public broadcasting was born, and it had what is called the Reithian principles, and Sir Reith, who is the first BBC Director General, came to South Africa twice to design the system, both during the colonial period and during the apartheid period. We owe it to him the decision to broadcast throughout the country in indigenous languages, and I'll tell you why the retreat from that is so pernicious to development in our country. The first thing that he did was to instill the 7 Reithian principles. The 7 Reithian principles being universal access. Everybody, regardless of means, has the right to participate in the SABC system. right? Or in public broadcasting. That's the first Reithian ideal. The second Reithian ideal is that of speaking to citizens as citizens with rights rather than as consumers with optional market choices. So it's anti-market ideology at its inception, even before the Keynesian principles that were developed and applied after the Second World War. Then thirdly, it is developmental, in that it must operate like a New York bus. You'll excuse me, I cut my teeth at PBS, New York. It should bend for the weak in society, for women. It's supposed to, for kids. It's a big equalizer. And it's supposed to, in that way, enrich and equalize society. So that brings me to the fourth Reithian principle, egalitarianism. So the even-handedness in dealing with citizens, whether they are poor or rich, or whether they are middle class, is particularly important, especially in the view of the latter-day tendency of advertising, especially at the SABC, to stratify citizens into LSM measures. So egalitarianism, non-commercial interest. Then the other thing was its independence. And its independence was twofold. It was an arm's length to commercial vested interest and an arm's length to the state. And that was unequivocal. And that is why the funding model had direct payments from the public in the form of the TV license, as or so Reith thought it would apply. But it could only apply in Britain. The other Reithian principles you all know, quality and healthy programming that's good for souls, good for society. So it was this colossus that was supposed to enrich democracy and ensure that citizens get a voice. In South Africa, it was introduced by the British. Again, at the dawn of democracy, DFID did a lot of funding, and in fact, DFID did almost a cut and paste in the design of the act that is in force now, that came into effect in 1999. And they worked, of course, with civil society here in South Africa, but the main instrument that DFID used to liberalize and neoliberalize our, and design this problematic funding model was what was going on with the BBC in Britain at the dawn of our own democracy. So they had the three-tier system, that's the MDDA side, the public broadcasting side, and the commercial side, and they entrenched it into the law. And then, of course, they criminalized non-payment of the television license, as did the Brits, as well as they gave it Reithian principles as its main mandate. The mandate is the Reithian principles, and the remit is national scope. Now, like the British, it was almost a cut and paste, remember? They decided, as the neoliberal years went on, to defund. It was called state retrenchment. So the 5 principles of neoliberalism are privatization, sell your assets, your goodies to the market. And you remember in 96, soon after democracy, we flogged 6 of our good performing radio stations, remember my favorite, Jacaranda, to the market and only fetched less than 1 billion, more or less, take a billion. Then liberalize. And when we liberalized, we took Centec, the highest, the money maker. And by the way, for every state-owned enterprise, I hate it when people compare us to what the Boers did in the apartheid years, because the Boers had, for every state enterprise, they had an anchor that was the money maker. For Eskom, it was the trader inside the Eskom's distribution transmission and generation. And then there was the trader that lies inside the middle asset, and that was the money maker. Our money maker was Centec. Do you remember that? And that is why now, if Centec called in the SABC debt, we would collapse. The SABC would collapse. I still say we sometimes. I shouldn't. So neoliberalism requires 5 things to happen to any asset. It needs to be run along individual lines, not collective communal lines. So you know that many of us as Africans have an antipathy for that. Then the second thing is that it advocates for increasing commercialization and privatization. By the way, when Centec was taken out of the SABC, the National Treasury never compensated the SABC for the loss of the money maker. And 30 years later almost, it's 26 next year, it's 2026 next year, the SABC must fetch its money from the fiscus because it took the SABC's infrastructure, its many profits, and all of that to build up Centec into the giant that it is now. And once it was made the signal distributor, we never were able to recoup the money lost. So it was a case of confiscation of property without compensation. We know how controversial that is in our country. So, so there is part of state retrenchment was the state flogging off performing assets and therefore weakening the balance sheet historically. I'm just historicizing the strangulation. Then the Centec loss was a profound loss. It is almost as if Transnet would lose Portnet, which is the main money maker. Because every time a ship turns around, you make money. It's like, that's part of the reason SAA failed in the later days, is because the main cross subsidies that the Boers kept in place with high direct contributions to the fiscus fell away during the neoliberal age. Because our government believed in rolling back and leaving people to their individual choices, because the market and the invisible hand of the market would redistribute spoils in our new democracy and see to democracy. But guess what? Piketty says that never happened. Instead, you saw plunging domestic incomes. Hence, I decided to say, okay, there have been too many opinions, and for me, there have been too many emotions. So this is what's going to happen. I'm going to mount a quantitative study, pure statistics. And I'm going to look at triangulating 3 different large data sets, crunching the numbers through data analysis, and coming out with what works and what doesn't work. So I looked at the year-on-year evasion rate of the SABC, which currently stands at 87%. Didn't just look at it, I looked at which provinces are deficient in paying, which social groups, which groups of people are refusing to support the public broadcaster, refusing to support the public broadcaster. My assumption, my research assumption going in is that this is a matrix of disenchantment, of disengagement from the public institution. And lo and behold, I got a big shock that it wasn't a matrix. My hypothesis was disproved. Because when triangulated with the household survey, now the Stats South Africa has got what you call the October household survey. It surveys households across South Africa and it quantifies, there are 18 million households in the country, and then it gives average incomes, and then it also says how many of these 18 million households are above the poverty baseline at a particular point, and how many are below. And it has the upper baseline for poverty and the lower baseline for poverty. Then the household survey has a section on media consumption and access. I didn't know this, so I was extremely excited when I discovered that. And one of the questions are, which media do you engage with the most? Universally across the land, it was SABC. Middle class, I thought, had deserted to DSTV, and now we're no, the engagement was SABC. It was soap operas, it was the rest of the SABC 1 bouquet, as well as a good section of both 2 and 3. So the household survey says that it's not a disengagement from the SABC. It is a poverty matrix. The evasion is a poverty matrix. So I then developed a secondary hypothesis, which is that the 200 and, how much is it now, 260 something, is unaffordable. So I generated a heat map of the evasion rate against the poverty map. And bingo, there it was, with the only outlier being Gauteng. So it is a poverty matrix. South Africans have got plunging domestic incomes over the democratic period. And if you look at the latest, over the last 7 years, there is a deepening of the SABC evasion rate. And if you can bear the hypothesis that over those years you've had 3 successive recessions, economic recessions, then you can see the condition that South African households are in. And the household survey said 11% of the 18 million households do not have TVs. And those are mainly in the Northern Cape and in certain rural areas. And they say there is a gender profile to the evasion rate. Women-headed households are just not paying those TV licenses, and even child-headed households in KZN and places like the evasion rate is highest in Gauteng and KZN rural, as well as Eastern Cape and Northern Cape, the poor areas. That's where the evasion rate is biting most. So to have a tax, a personal story. I once was invited by the former minister. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So the evasion rate is a poverty matrix. Then the second thing that we tried to triangulate is the IEC. It released its last disengagement from voting in South Africa rate. And that is at 40, it's around 45 at the moment, which is really high. And it has a socioeconomic profile as well, with poor people being subject to that. So what are the solutions to the TV license regime problem? It is certainly not the household survey. The household levy merely moves the point of payment to the household rather than the post office and so on. But it faces the same socioeconomic profile, and it will face the same household survey problems that Eskom has when it tries to collect in the poor areas. It'll face the same problem that Rand Water has when it tries to collect in the municipalities. The household survey, the household levy is an attempt, like the Chinese did, to collect it when you collect your utilities. That is going to bring the SABC into social conflict with South African households. It's just moving the point of pay, but they're still using the individual user pay model. So what needs to happen is a generalized tax across the working population given the fact that we have the highest unemployment rate ever. And that cross-subsidy, which is a form of a progressive tax, should be what other people pay for the democracy to be enjoyed and experienced by others through the communication of democracy. The other thing is that I feel that is a long time coming. And by the way, the New Zealand theoreticians are saying that those policy lacuna that the government leaves in the broadcasting regulations, like our government has left a lacuna, the digital transition lacuna was pernicious, and it lasted for the entire democratic period, almost. And then the other pernicious lacuna is the decision to leave the SABC hanging dry without a viable it's not a benign lacuna left like that. It has happened in many other countries when the neoliberalization is failing and the collection costs are burdensome. Thanks for mentioning the collection costs, because in 2020, the SABC's collection costs were higher than what they collected. Yeah, so they were paying that agency money for jam. It's serious that we look at having no collection costs, like supporting the SABC to ring-fence sports rights without having to go and bid and pay for them, like the South American broadcasters ring-fence sports rights for their broadcasters. Number 3, they need to hive off the part that is not subject to the public mandate and allow SABC enterprises to list on the JSE so that the public can have another bite at the asset through direct share ownership. And if the public does that, that's a capital raising exercise. Now, there is precedent for that. Remember, under Sizwe Nxasane, Telkom listed and rang the bell on the JSE and also listed in New York. There is no reason why the SABC, even in its current state, cannot mount, supported by the state, of course, a capital raising exercise through the markets and a mission to get South Africans, almost campaign for South Africans to buy shares, even for 100 Rand each, 20 Rand each, and make that public offer. Because after all, they buy MTN shares, they buy other forms of shares. So a capital raising that goes with a campaign for public broadcasting to remain and to be endorsed, rather than a negative plebiscite as wanted by the minister, whether we need this dwe-dwe or not. So I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Thandeka. I mean, an absolutely fascinating kind of deep dive into, can you come back? So we need to have a further discussion about this. So I just want to ask Oyanda, can we go to 11:15 so that we have half an hour for conversation? Thank you. So I want to particularly look at what your recommendations are for a way forward. And both of you have pointed to that in very interesting ways. And I want you to kind of comment on various things that I'm going to put to you. So the first one, which I thought was really interesting, Thandeka, was your universal public media levy, which you talked about in your presentation and you were touching on now. So it's the idea that you get public money in. So could you just unpack a little bit more that? And then, Dimitri, I want you to also talk about that. I mean, on an ongoing basis, we've talked about the fact that there has been so little public money that has gone into our public broadcaster. And I'm just looking at one of the stats here, about 3.7% of state support. I mean, that's minuscule. I mean, to the point that it becomes a joke to talk about a public service broadcaster. So, Thandeka, starting with you, government, public money.
It's 0.5 at the last, and it was negated by the TV license fees that even the government departments owe to the SABC. So it's cancelled out.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, then here's the thing about the public levy and how it would operate.
Yeah.
It operates as a general tax levied across the working population, collected by SARS as part of the thing. That would be called a prescribed tax.
Yeah.
What I was going to tell you when you stopped me
Yeah.
was that I tiptoed to go and see Tito Mboweni after some meeting, and he said, no, National Treasury is neoliberal, my dear. They are against prescribed taxes. So what we need to do is to ensure that whatever is collected as tax, or if we do get a prescribed levy, it goes through Parliament, through an appropriations committee of Parliament, and is given, almost like the American model, to an independent body, which independent body then disperses it to various public service media, including the SABC. Do you get me?
Yes.
Yes. Then it's distinct from the clawback, which I believe we should embark on, the clawback from big tech.
For big tech.
Yeah. So the clawback from big tech, it cannot come to us directly, by the way, Kate. It has to go into the fiscus, because it's national money, it's taxpayers' money that the country is clawing back from big tech, which should be paying tax here but doesn't. So that clawback must be given to that entity, that body, that also receives the appropriation for public service media. So the Americans call it the Commission for Public Media, or they've got a name for it, but that body disperses it to public media, depending on some different criteria.
Okay, and just a quick question, a follow-up. When you talk about public media, so it's the SABC, and what else would be included there?
Okay, so the latest research, both Furi and Priscilla Boshoff and others are saying that if public media is to survive in the digital era, it must lose its attachment to the exact infrastructure or the apparatus for public media, and that we should call a set of principles for the media, regardless of what platform it uses. We should have that remit of principles and operational beliefs, PSM, public service media, rather than call the kind of old industrial apparatuses that we use. We shouldn't call that only public media, even though we should refund it and it shouldn't die.
Thank you very much. So, Dimitri, I would love you to comment on Thandeka's proposals, and also then talk to the issue of, public funding. What are your views?
Yes, I think, the idea of public service media beyond the SABC as an institution certainly has had some traction, and there's been discussion, for example, whether commercial entities like ETV could access funding because of programming public media, public service media, or public interest content. I think there's been a lot of support, including then community media. The Broadcasting Act also envisages other institutions, even though they've never been established, but there is a provision in the Broadcasting Act that a publicly owned entity can provide public service programming or broadcasting. Then in terms of the progressive tax, I think certainly, taking it away from the household and putting that responsibility on the population that is earning, it makes a lot of sense. In terms of collection efficiency, SARS is certainly one of the efficient institutions. That makes a lot of sense. Yes, it has to be ring-fenced, though, going into the fiscus and potentially disappearing, like the proceeds of the Centec separation, the proceeds of the regional radio stations, those should have gone to the SABC, didn't. And so it's important that that is ring-fenced and we have a guaranteed source of funding. The idea of having a new institution, they've spoken about a digital development fund. I'm always fearful of yet another institution which might be taking money to run itself rather than the money going directly to, but that's perhaps something we could reflect on.
So, and then a follow-up to both of you on that. So you're talking about this institution which will, you know, basically manage the money and then distribute it. And that's an amazing idea in theory. I mean, the devil is in the detail around that. And I just want the both of you to reflect on this body. Who manages it? Who's represented on it? How does it work? Tandeka.
In my view, it should work, it should have a very rigid appointment criteria, such as those applied when you are having public officials who should be above reproach appointed into positions, such as the public protector, the process for that. And it should be run by people who are drawn from the community that stands to benefit from the disbursement of those assets. So they must be democratically minded people, non-racialists, no bigots, must be coming from, you know, rural parts of South Africa, urban parts of South Africa, and have the skills and the understandings of why the media is such an important democracy propeller. However, I just wanted to take issue with what Dimitri said. You know, one of the reasons why public goods are eroded by market ideologies like neoliberalism is that they believe that where there is market failure, only when the tooth fairy, called the invisible hand of the market, fails to distribute the goods in society equitably, then and there is no money to be made in that market, then we must offload our toxic assets onto the state, which is what private media companies will do en masse if you allow them to define themselves as public goods. They must just get busy with their for-profit things, and then we will do inkonzo zoluntu, which is the conversations of humanity. They must get busy with the market, and then we can be building a nation. But they mustn't define themselves as public goods. Public goods are very specific things in economics. They are those things which are non-rivalrous, non-competitive, that are, that if you use them and I use them, they are non-depletable and they are good for all of society.
Thank you. Dimitri?
Well, not that I have to defend that idea because it wasn't but I agree with that point. I was simply repeating what has been proposed there. I see the only other analogy in the country to the SABC as a state-owned, as an asset, is South African National Parks, for example, where, you know, that's our natural heritage. I see the SABC as our cultural heritage. So the board of the SABC are like the custodians of this. And so in the same way as, for example, one would go to, let's say, the Kruger Park, some people will be staying in a modest accommodation. Others who have got more money will go and stay in whatever fancy accommodation, and it would be cross-subsidizing and making sure that that asset is. So for me, that is the progressive tax in some sense. Where are we today? Because you're right, this thing's going to take time. What is to be done now within the next couple of years, where the Ministry of Communications has proposed to take another 2 years to review number one, legislation, number two, the type of regulator that we need. I'm saying we don't need to wait for that policy process to end before we start regulating the OTTs. The Competition
Thank you,
Commission
because I was
has
going to
said-
say, I really want you to get into the regulating of the OTT, so thank you. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so the Competition Commission has already proposed that a 500 million fund is established for journalism, etc. And the SABC should be one of the entities that can draw from that. Where's that money? Which fund? It's the same question about how it's going to be done. All I'm saying, it mustn't be yet another bureaucracy that's going to chow half the money rather than the money going into the media.
Fantastic. I now want to open to the floor to get some questions for our esteemed panelists. So yeah, I'll take 3 questions and then we'll, yeah, thank you. At the back.
Good morning. I'm Kolile from Animation South Africa. Just a quick view on perspective. Does public service media have to be necessarily primarily driven by an SABC? And one could take that even further by any state entities. I mean, we live in the age of the creator economy. Why are we still trying to sort of shoehorn an old methodology into the new sphere that we're in? So that's the first question. And then if you were to go the state route, should it only be SABC? Because I think there are different players in the ecosystem, FPB, etc., that would add value to the whole public service media sphere. Thanks.
So I'm going to take 2 other questions and then I'll get you to answer. Yeah, at the front.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you very much to SOS for organizing this symposium. It's actually a crucial conversation to have. And just the point that you were making, Thandeka, about the listing and in a way to try and raise capital. It's interesting because it's a conversation that we've had, but it boils down to what Dimitri was saying about the absence of policy, that you're trying to figure out a funding model when you actually don't have the policy infrastructure to inform it. So it's something that we've sort of started talking about. But I do think that the idea that the board is the custodian of the SABC and you trust that it would do good, I do think that we need to look at how the board is appointed. It gives us comfort that it's sitting in parliament, but the outcome does not serve the SABC. You end up with less skills that you actually require on the board, but more people who are appointed primarily on demographics, because it's driven mainly by demographics. We have women, we have youth, we have that. But what does the SABC need in terms of the skills that are supposed to exercise oversight? So I do think that it's something that should be looked into. But the other point on the alternatives for revenue, I do think that the multi-party funding model that is serving political parties should actually be considered for the SABC, because the work that goes into protecting democracy and strengthening democracy falls within that, that space. So if there's money, I mean, the recent pronouncement by the finance minister saying that political parties should be funded fully from the fiscus. If private entities like political parties that the public has no say on are going to be funded from the fiscus fully in saying we want to protect them from being influenced by foreign actors, the SABC plays a crucial role in the democracy that we're talking about. And these parties can't get their messaging to the audience, to the citizens, without the SABC playing part in the process. So I do think that there's got to be a strong submission that talks with the SABC getting money from the multi-party fund democracy.
Morning, I'm Zahra Matani. I'm a candidate attorney at the Legal Resources Center, so I'm a bit out of my depth, legal mind in a room full of very capable journalists. But something that we've noticed across the board with the level of austerity budgeting is that there tends to be civic rights or civilian rights or political rights, whatever you call it, are taking more and more of a back seat when the budget is disseminated, whereby, things are said, but it goes unfunded, so it can't be realized. And I think that has also played a massive role in the deterioration of public service media, because you can't, as the SABC, you can't say that the SABC must fulfill XYZ mandate, but not allow them the tools to do so. And I think that's why the idea of the progressive levy makes so much sense, but also, bearing in mind the fact that South Africans are also feeling squeezed so hard at the moment, where a lot of people are struggling just to make ends meet. To introduce a newer tax may also see people demonize or demonize the SABC. So I think it's just a very fine balancing act between funding and then the court of public opinion.
Great. Thanks. So what I would like you to do is to reply, comment on the comments we've got from the floor, and then also give your final remarks. Thanks. And over to you, Thandeka, and then you, Dimitri.
Sir, at the Windhoek Declaration, when many of the African countries decided what to do about public broadcasting, they said they are going to put public broadcasting at the center of the public sphere for very particular reasons. Because where media addresses mainly private citizens as consumers for profit, an important thing happens. There's a skewing that happens, and poor people and people who don't speak the languages of dominance get left behind. Hence the decision to have public broadcasting at the center of the media systems or the public sphere. It's a whole debate on its own, and I'd like to engage it later. Then, as to the listing, I'm happy, Patiswa, that you guys are thinking about listing. I think, given the squeeze at the moment, it's the only strategic way forward. It's one of the big strategic ways forward. And a listing would certainly stave off the growing debt, and it would be able to recapitalize you directly without going through the fiscus and without needing another fiscal injection. So it is a very strategic consideration, but also for moral and campaign reasons, to actually, on your capital raising mission, going around the country speaking about the need for public broadcasting to survive. And people will surprise you, they'll put in their 2 cents, their 3 cents, like they do in the periphery of the country. If a school is dying in the rural areas, you don't get to hear about that because it's never covered here. But parents put in money, and they really do. And the third thing is, if they could consider, and I agree with you entirely on hiving off a portion of the political party funding, and finding a mechanism for it to go to the central body that I'm talking about. And then on the monetization of training, the middle part of the SABC, which is SABC Education, has to do what Al Jazeera is doing with the Al Jazeera Academy in both London and in Doha. And they're raking in a lot, Patiswa, through training and offering training on a a basis. So if you can take some of those highly skilled people that were retrenched, unfortunately, and return them to teach all those things like drone deployment, studio management, all those kind of skills that and animation and so on, they are returning, and Netflix is showing us that those skills are sexy again. And documentary filmmaking is making a killing now with Netflix and, you know, Beauty and the Beast and The Best and whatever. But basically, monetize training, lease out the equipment that resides in OBs, let people charge for that, open up Henley, let people charge people for the use of Henley. Even the Broadcasting Act permits you to do that. Oh, ma'am, on the issue of the levy, the request, even from the British, is that the levy be gentle. And it's not as offensive as the TV license. I've got the text in my phone asking me to pay. But here's the thing. The Japanese public broadcaster is called NHK, right? And the Japanese society is very middle class, more advanced socially than us, and they had to give up on they are having to give up on the TV license regime in a different socioeconomic profile, because they were sending people up those high rises, and the people were telling them to buzz off in not so polite Japanese. So and NHK cannot raise advertising; it's prohibited by law from doing so. So and the BBC is moving away from the TV license regime, even in a different socioeconomic profile. So how much more us?
I'd like to pick up perhaps on this last point, that the SABC already has a right in law to raise this from the public. So if we see it as perhaps just taking that same right and changing the method of collection, for example, that it's not a new tax, because I agree with you that that is where there will be pushback. If it's presented to Treasury as a new tax and so on, then, you know, even if there isn't an understanding, and I think that's also part of the challenge, where you have, you know, accountants in Treasury who are having to make decisions about content and so on, something they're not familiar with. So the fact is that it's a right that's already enshrined in law, and it's about using that in a way to say, okay, how are we going to amend that particular method of collection? The second, where you say that you know, constitutional rights are being eroded precisely through budget cuts, is seeing the constitutional role that SABC plays as a cornerstone of this democracy, as you know, and that as the legal underpinning for you know, public funding of the broadcaster. Patiswa, I agree with you. The appointment of the SABC board, absolutely something that you know, it's the politics is the problem, precisely. But so if we say that, you know, that board, if that board becomes the funding, the decision making, the custodian of public service media, and that's the kind of change that we're looking for, I really believe that we could have, again, and linking to your point about, is it only the SABC as an institution? Well, of course, that is the key institution in public service media. But there's nothing to say, for example, that this fund can now not fund animation, content that is public interest content, if we can call it that more broadly, so that producers can access public funding to create content for the public service media. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks so much. Program Director, you said that there was a question online. Okay, sorry. So our colleagues online, I don't want to exclude you, and thank you, Program Director, for reminding me that we obviously have a lot of colleagues online. Is there any question from our online audience before we finish? No. Okay, well, thank you. And thank you so much to my two panelists. I think this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion and very positive. I feel positively buoyed, which is generally when I have discussions about the SABC, I don't. So this is really good. Tandeka, you want one last comment? Please go ahead.
What's happening in America in light of that write-off, completely cancelling public broadcasting and so on, is that there's a group of journalists and scholars who have decided to mount campaigns called Return to the Commons, meaning that we need to return to acting collectively. Those commons, whether those commons are libraries, whether those commons are community schools, or whether common provisioning for certain things, or common provisioning for creches, and public broadcasting has come back to the fore as part of this resistance against this disemboweling of the institutions of democracy by rampant market ideology and individualism. So, if you want to speak to me later about the commons, you can talk to me.
I think that's a beautiful way to finish. Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you, Dimitri and Tandeka. Would like to take a photograph with the panelist and the moderator for the session. Just stand by for your packages as well, please. Thank you, Carol. Round of applause again, please. All right, so because we managed to catch up on time, we will be having a 15-minute break. So we'll be back in the room at 11:30, please, and we will continue from there. Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.
Songi bandeko ye likambo na motema ye ngai na motema unu para kileba chulilo lutua oh na makambo ye
Nasimakot idiot onina wanika mon pulling moi mutande not ukuna be no wat du tunyimba mule mat ebukimba mabot ilena boy mona wa bongo jita amunja mit inyandolo weapon ba meset mona menwe kata midongot bukato be no wat now mende kata wiyat na sivinje na imende no vola ruku unyolangoye Ilbo sambo we pombo wana Halloween. Il kine walote kine kimila boku mama. Oningwa mama na mwana utakota te. Putuna mo imamele na kopunda. Mobotia zami sisae mwana ndefu lolo nyuso sala ponangao mamele na bungang mamele masuma pona bombe na dalowina indanaknde ntosengato malia mama mawas na wesa no moyo wala ye wila so wana upa oh my Bosambo boni sisi ana dalowina Pinyolo mwande Angona mulatoi nsinga malia Mukanda wo bakaka Balimba nate na subu Nimele soman matila kupuna dibe munyenge Like leggy to jamon japmo bang fog ne damon fate Yan say jofe jamon rek lo du chagem damon baye Ir lañu de for manon consul nañu melo Tequila yatalo